The majority of them were enlightened and anti-clerical, paid not the least attention to the bishop, and would have preferred to turn the cloisters and abbeys into warehouses or factories. In their distress, the proud, powerful men of the town council condescended to write an abject petition, begging the bishop to curse and excommunicate this monster who murdered young girls, and yet whom temporal powers could not capture, just as his illustrious predecessor had done in the year 1708, when terrible locusts had threatened the land. And indeed, at the end of September, the slayer of the young women of Grasse, having cut down no fewer than 24 of its most beautiful virgins out of every social class, was made anathema and excommunicated, both in writing and from all the pulpits of the city, including a ban spoken by the bishop himself from the pulpit of Notre-Dame-du-Puy. The result was conclusive. From one day to the next the murders ceased. October and November passed with no corpses. At the start of December, reports came in from Grenoble that a murderer there was strangling young girls, then tearing their clothes to shreds and pulling their hair out by the handfuls. And although these coarse methods in no way squared with the cleanly executed crimes of the Grasse murderer, everyone was convinced that it was one and the same person. In their relief that the beast was no longer among them, but instead ravaging Grenoble, a good 7 days' journey distant, the citizens of Grasse crossed themselves 3 times over. They organized a torchlight procession in honor of the bishop, and celebrated a Mass of Thanksgiving on December the 24th. On January the 1st, 1766, the tighter security measures were relaxed, and the night-time curfew for women was lifted. Normality returned to public and private life with incredible speed. Fear had melted into thin air. No one spoke of the terror that had ruled both town and countryside only a few months before. Not even the families involved still spoke of it. It was as if the bishop's curse had not only banned the murderer, but every memory of him, and the people were pleased that it was so. But any man who still had a daughter just approaching that special age did not, even now, allow her to be without supervision. Twilight brought misgivings, and each morning, when he found her healthy and cheerful, he rejoiced, though of course without actually admitting the reason why. 41. There was one man in Grasse, however, who did not trust this peace. His name was Antoine Richy. He held the title of second consul, and he lived in a grand residence at the entrance to the Rue Droite. Richy was a widower and had a daughter named Laure. Although not yet 40 years old and of undiminished vigour, he intended to put off a second marriage for some time yet. First, he wanted to find a husband for his daughter, and not the first-comer either, but a man of rank. There was a Baron de Bouillon who had a son and an estate near Vence, a man of good reputation and miserable financial situation, with whom Richy had already concluded a contract concerning the future marriage of their children. Once he had married Laure off, he planned to put out his own courting feelers in the direction of the highly esteemed houses of Dreux, Maubert, or Fontmichel, not because he was vain and would be damned if he didn't get a noble bedmate, but because he wanted to found a dynasty and to put his own posterity on a track leading directly to the highest social and political influence. For that he needed at least 2 sons, one to take over his business, the other to pursue a law career leading to the Parliament in Aix and advancement to the nobility. Given his present rank, however, he could hold out hopes for such success only if he managed intimately to unite his own person and family with provincial nobility. Only one thing justified such high-soaring plans: his fabulous wealth. Antoine Richy was far and away the wealthiest citizen anywhere around. He possessed latifundia not only in the area of Grasse, where he planted oranges, oil, wheat, and hemp, but also near Vence and over toward Antibes, where he leased out his farms. He owned houses in Aix and houses in the country, owned shares in ships that traded with India, had a permanent office in Genoa, and was the largest wholesaler for scents, spices, oils, and leathers in France. The most precious thing that Richy possessed, however, was his daughter. She was his only child, just turned 16, with auburn hair and green eyes. She had a face so charming that visitors of all ages and both sexes would stand stock still at the sight of her, unable to pull their eyes away, practically licking that face with their eyes, the way tongues work at ice cream, with that typically stupid, single-minded expression on their faces that goes with concentrated licking. Even Rishi would catch himself looking at his daughter for indefinite periods of time, a quarter of an hour, a half-hour perhaps, forgetting the rest of the world, even his business, which otherwise did not happen even in his sleep, melting away in contemplation of this magnificent girl, and afterwards unable to say what it was he had been doing. And of late he noticed this with uneasiness, of an evening when he brought her to her bed, or sometimes of a morning when he went in to waken her, and she still lay sleeping, as if put to rest by God's own hand, and the forms of her hips and breasts were moulded in the veil of her nightgown, and her breath rose, calm and hot, from the frame of bosom, contoured shoulder, elbow, and smooth forearm in which she had laid her face. Then he would feel an awful cramping in his stomach, and his throat would seem too tight, and he would swallow, and, God help him, would curse himself for being this woman's father, and not some stranger, not some other man, before whom she lay as she lay now before him, and who then, without scruple and full of desire, could lie down next to her, on her, in her. And he broke out in a sweat, and his arms and legs trembled while he choked down this dreadful lust, and bent down to wake her with a chaste fatherly kiss. During the year just past, at the time of the murders, these fatal temptations had not yet come over him. The magic that his daughter worked on him then, or so at least it seemed to him, had still been a childish magic, and thus he had not been seriously afraid that Laure would be one of the murderer's victims, since everyone knew that he attacked neither children nor grown women, but exclusively ripening but virginal girls. He had indeed augmented the watch of his home, had had new grilles placed at the windows of the top floor, and had directed Laure's maid to share her bedchamber with her. But he was loath to send her away as his peers had done with their daughters, some even with their entire families. He found such behaviour despicable and unworthy of a member of the town council and second consul, who, he suggested, should be a model of composure, courage, and resolution to his fellow citizens. Besides which, he was a man who did not let his decisions be made for him by other people, nor by a crowd thrown into panic, and certainly not by some anonymous piece of criminal trash. And so all during those terrible days, he had been one of the few people in the town who were immune to the fever of fear, and kept a cool head. But strange to say, this had now changed. While others publicly celebrated the end of the rampage as if the murderer were already hanged, and had soon fully forgotten about those dreadful days, fear crept into Antoine Richy's heart like a foul poison. For a long time he would not admit that it was fear that caused him to delay trips that ought to have been made some time ago, or to be reluctant merely to leave the house, or to break off visits and meetings, just so that he could quickly return home. He gave himself the excuse that he was out of sorts or overworked, but admitted as well that he was a bit concerned, as every father with a daughter of marriageable age is concerned, a thoroughly normal concern. Had not the fame of her beauty already gone out to the wider world? Did not people stretch their necks even now when he accompanied her to church on Sundays? Were not certain gentlemen on the council already making advances, in their own names or in those of their sons? 42. But then, one day in March, Richy was sitting in the salon and watched as Laure walked out into the garden. She was wearing a blue dress, her red hair falling down over it and blazing in the sunlight. He had never seen her look so beautiful. She disappeared behind a hedge, and it took about 2 heartbeats longer than he had expected before she emerged again, and he was frightened to death, for during those 2 heartbeats he thought he had lost her forever. That same night he awoke out of a terrifying dream, the details of which he could no longer remember, but it had to do with law, and he burst into her room, convinced that she was dead, lay there in her bed, murdered, violated and shorn, and found her unharmed. He went back to his chamber, bathed in sweat and trembling with agitation. No, not with agitation, but with fear, for he finally admitted it to himself. It was naked fear that had seized him, and in admitting it he grew calmer and his thoughts clearer. To be honest, he had not believed in the efficacy of the bishop's anathema from the start, nor that the murderer was now prowling about Grenoble, nor that he had ever left town. No, he was still living here, among the citizens of Grasse, and at some point he would strike again. Ricci had seen several of the girls murdered during August and September. The sight had horrified him, and at the same time, he had to admit, fascinated him, for they all, each in her own special way, had been of dazzling beauty. He never would have thought that there was so much unrecognized beauty in Grasse. The murderer had opened his eyes. The murderer possessed exquisite taste. And he had a system. It was not just that all the murders had been carried out in the same efficient manner, but the very choice of victims betrayed intentions almost economical in their planning. To be sure, Ricci did not know what the murderer actually craved from his victims, since he could not have robbed them of the best that they offered, their beauty and the charm of youth. Or could he? In any case, it seemed to him, as absurd as it sounded, that the murderer was not a destructive personality, but rather a careful collector. For if one imagined, and so Ricci imagined, all the victims not as single individuals, but as parts of some higher principle, and thought of each one's characteristics as merged in some idealistic fashion into a unifying whole, then the picture assembled out of such mosaic pieces would be the picture of absolute beauty, and the magic that radiated from it would no longer be of human, but of divine origin. As we can see, Ricci was an enlightened thinker who did not shrink from blasphemous conclusions, and though he was not thinking in olfactory categories, but rather in visual ones, he was nevertheless very near the truth. Assuming, then, Ricci continued in his thoughts, that the murderer was just such a collector of beauty, and was working on the picture of perfection, even if only in the fantasy of his sick brain. Assuming, moreover, that he was the man of sublime taste and perfect methods that he indeed appeared to be, then one could not assume that he would waive claim to the most precious component on earth needed for his picture, the beauty of law. His entire previous homicidal work would be worth nothing without her. She was the keystone to his building. As he drew this horrifying conclusion, Ricci was sitting in his nightshirt on the edge of his bed, and he was amazed at how calm he had become. He no longer felt chilled, was no longer trembling. The vague fear that had plagued him for weeks had vanished, and was replaced by the awareness of a specific danger. Law had quite obviously been the goal of all the murderer's endeavours from the beginning, and all the other murders were adjuncts to the last, crowning murder. It remained quite unclear what material purpose these murders were intended to serve, or even if they had one at all. But Ricci had perceived the essence of the matter, the murderer's systematic method and his idealistic motive. The longer he thought about it, the better both of these pleased him, and the greater his admiration for the murderer, an admiration, admittedly, that reflected back upon him as would a polished mirror, for after all it was he, Ricci, who had picked up on his opponent's trail with his own refined and analytical powers of reasoning. If he, Ricci, had been the murderer, and were himself possessed by the murderer's passions and ideas, he would not have been able to proceed in any other fashion than had been employed thus far, and like him, he would do his utmost to crown his mad work with the murder of the unique and splendid Laure. This last thought appealed to him especially, Because he was in the position to put himself inside the mind of the would-be murderer of his daughter, he had made himself vastly superior to the murderer. For all his intelligence, that much was certain, the murderer was not in the position to put himself inside Richie's mind, if only because he could not even begin to suspect that Richie had long since imagined himself in the murderer's own situation. This was fundamentally no different from how things worked in business, mutatis mutandis, to be sure. You were master of a competitor whose intentions you had seen through. There was no way he could get the better of you, not if your name was Antoine Richie, and you were a natural fighter, a seasoned fighter. After all, the largest wholesale perfume business in France, his wealth, his office as second consul, these had not fallen into his lap as gracious gifts, but he had fought for them, with doggedness and deceit, recognizing dangers ahead of time, shrewdly guessing his competitors' plans, and outdistancing his opponents. And in just the same way he would achieve his future goals, power, and noble rank for his heirs, and in no other way would he counter the plans of the murderer, his competitor for the possession of Laure, if only because Laure was also the keystone in the edifice of Richie's own plans. He loved her, certainly, but he needed her as well, and he would let no one wrest from him whatever it was he needed to realize his own highest ambitions. He would hold on tooth and claw to that. He felt better now. Having succeeded by these nocturnal deliberations in bringing his struggle with the demon down to the level of a business rivalry, he felt fresh courage, indeed arrogance, take hold of him. The last remnants of fear were gone. The despondency and anxious care that had tormented him into doddering senility had vanished. The fog of gloomy forebodings in which he had tapped about for weeks had lifted. He found himself on familiar terrain, and felt himself equal to every challenge. 43. Relieved, almost elated, he sprang from his bed, pulled the bell-rope, and ordered the drowsy valet who staggered into his room to pack clothes and provisions, because at daybreak he intended to set out for Grenoble in the company of his daughter. Then he dressed and chased the rest of the servants from their beds. In the middle of the night, the house on the Rue Droite awoke and bustled with life. The fire blazed up in the kitchen, excited maids scurried along the corridors, servants dashed up and down stairs. In the vaulted cellars the keys of the steward rattled. In the courtyard torches shone, grooms ran among the horses, others tugged mules from their stalls. There was bridling and saddling and running and loading. One would have almost believed that the Austro-Sardinian hordes were on the march, pillaging and torching, just as in 1746, and that the lord of the manor was mobilizing to flee in panic. Not at all. The lord of the manor was sitting at his office desk, as sovereign as a marshal of France, drinking café au lait and providing instructions for the constant stream of domestics barging in on him. All the while he wrote letters to the mayor, to the first consul, to his secretary, to his solicitor, to his banker in Marseille, to the Baron de Bouillon, and to diverse business partners. By around 6 that morning he had completed his correspondence and given all the orders necessary to carry out his plans. He tucked away 2 small travelling pistols, buckled on his money belt, and locked his desk. Then he went to awaken his daughter. By 8 o'clock the little caravan was on the move. Richie rode at its head. He was a splendid sight in his gold-braided burgundy coat, beneath a black riding-coat and black hat with jaunty feathers. He was followed by his daughter, dressed less showily, but so radiantly beautiful that the people along the street and at the windows had eyes only for her, their fervent ahs and ohs passing through the crowd while the men doffed their hats, apparently for the second consul, but in reality for her, the regal woman. Then, almost unnoticed, came her maid, then Richie's valet, with 2 pack-horses. The notoriously bad condition of the road to Grenoble meant that a wagon could not be used, and the end of the parade was drawn up by a dozen mules laden with all sorts of stuff and supervised by 2 grooms. At the Porte du Cours the watch presented arms, and only let them drop when the last mule had tramped by. Children ran behind them for a good little while, waving at the baggage crew as they slowly moved up the steep, winding road into the mountains. The departure of Antoine Richy and his daughter made a strange but deep impression on people. It was as if they had witnessed some archaic sacrificial procession. The word spread that Richy was going to Grenoble, to the very city where the monster who murdered young girls was now residing. People did not know what to think about that. Did what Richy was doing show criminal negligence or admirable courage? Was he daring or placating the gods? They had only the vague foreboding that they had just seen this beautiful girl with the red hair for the last time. They suspected that Laure Richy might be lost. This suspicion would prove correct, although the presumptions it was based upon were completely false. Richy was not heading for Grenoble at all. The pompous departure was nothing but a diversionary tactic. A mile and a half northwest of Grasse, near the village of Saint-Vallier, he ordered a halt. He handed his valet letters of attorney and transmittal, and ordered him to bring the mule train and grooms to Grenoble by himself. He, however, turned off with Laure and her maid in the direction of Cabris, where they rested at midday, and then rode straight across the mountains of the Tanneron toward the south. The path was an extremely arduous one, but it allowed them to circumvent Grasse and its basin in a great arc, and to arrive on the coast by evening without being recognized. The following day, according to Richy's plan, he would ferry across with Laure to the Ile de l'Airain, on the smaller of which was located the well-fortified monastery of Saint-Honorat. It was managed by a handful of elderly but quite able-bodied monks, whom Richy knew very well, since for years he had bought and resold the monastery's total production of eucalyptus cordial, pine nuts, and cypress oil. And there, in the monastery of Saint-Honorat, which, except for the prison of Château d'If and the state prison on the Ile Sainte-Marguerite, was probably the safest place in the Provence, he intended to lodge his daughter for the present. But he would immediately return to the mainland, this time circumventing Grasse on the east via Antibes and Cagnes, and arrive in Vence by evening of the same day. He had ordered his secretary to proceed there in order to prepare the agreement with Baron de Bouillon concerning the marriage of their children Laure and Alphonse. He hoped to make Bouillon an offer that he could not refuse: assumption of his debts up to 40,000 livres, a dowry consisting of an equal sum, as well as diverse landholdings and an oil mill near Maganosque, a yearly income of 3,000 livres for the young couple. Richy's only conditions were that the marriage should take place within 10 days and be consummated on the wedding day, and that the couple should thereafter take up residence in Vence. Richy knew that in acting so hastily he was driving the price excessively high for the union of his house with the house of Bouillon. He would have got it cheaper had he waited longer. The Baron would have begged for permission to raise the social rank of the daughter of a bourgeois wholesaler through a marriage to his son, for the fame of Laure's beauty would only grow, just as would Richy's wealth and Bouillon's financial miseries. But what did that matter? His opponent in this deal was not the Baron, but the unknown murderer. He was the one whose business had to be spoiled. A married woman, deflowered and, if possible, already pregnant, would no longer fit into his exclusive gallery. The last mosaic stone would be tarnished. Laure would have lost all value for the murderer. His enterprise would have failed, and he was to feel his defeat. Richy wanted to hold the wedding ceremony in Grasse, with great pomp and open to the public. And even if he could not know his adversary, would never know him, he would take personal pleasure in knowing that he was in attendance at the event, and would have to watch with his own eyes as that which he most desired was snatched away from under his nose. The plan was nicely thought out, and once again we must admire Richy's acumen for coming so close to the truth. For in point of fact, the marriage of Laure Richy to the son of the Baron de Bouillon would have meant a devastating defeat for the murderer of the maidens of Grasse. But the plan was not yet carried out. Richy had not yet rescued his daughter by marrying her off. He had not yet ferried her across to the safety of the monastery of Saint-Honorat. The three riders were still passing through the inhospitable mountains of the Tanneron. Sometimes the path was so bad that they had to dismount from their horses. It was all going too slowly. By evening they hoped to reach the sea near La Napoule, a small town west of Cannes. 44. At the same time that Laure Richy and her father were leaving Grasse, Grenouille was at the other end of the town, in the Arnulfi workshop, macerating jonquils. He was alone, and he was in good spirits. His days in Grasse were coming to an end. His day of triumph was imminent. Out in his cabin was a crate padded with cotton. In it were 24 tiny flacons, filled with drops of the congealed aura of 24 virgins, precious essences that Grenouille had produced over the last year by cold oil enfleurage of their bodies, digestion of their hair and clothes, lavage and distillation. And the 25th, the most precious and important of all, he planned to fetch today. For his final fishing expedition, he had at the ready a small pot of oils, purified several times over, a cloth of finest linen, and a demijohn of high-proof alcohol. The terrain had been studied down to the last detail. The moon was new. He knew that any attempt to break into the well-protected mansion on the Rue Droite was pointless, which was why he planned, just as dusk fell and before the doors were closed, to sneak in under his cover of odorlessness, which like a magic cape deprived man and beast of their perceptive faculties, and there to hide in some nook of the house. Then later, when everyone was asleep, he would follow the compass of his nose through the darkness and climb up to the chamber that held his treasure. He would set to work on it with his oil-drenched cloths right then and there. All that he would take with him would be, as usual, the hair and clothes, since these could be washed directly in rectified spirit, which could be done more conveniently in the workshop. He estimated it would take an additional night to complete the production of the pomade and to distill the concentrate. And if everything went well, and he had no reason to doubt that everything would go well, then by the day after tomorrow he would possess all of the essences needed for the best perfume in the world, and he would leave Grasse as the world's most fragrant human being. Around noon he was finished with his jonquils. He doused the fire, covered the pot of oil, and stepped outside the workshop to cool off. The wind was from the west. With his very first breath, he knew something was wrong. The atmosphere was not as it should be. In the town's aromatic garb, that veil of many thousands of woven threads, the golden thread was missing. During the last few weeks, the fragrance of that thread had grown so strong that Grenouille had clearly discerned it from his cabin on the far side of the town. Now it was gone, vanished, untraceable, despite the most intensive sniffing. Grenouille was almost paralyzed with fright. "She is dead," he thought. Then, more terrifying still, someone else has got to her before me. Someone else has plucked my flower and taken its odour for himself. He could not so much as scream, the shock was too great for that, but he could produce tears that welled up in the corners of his eyes and suddenly streamed down both sides of his nose. Then Drouot, returning home from the Quatre Dauphins for lunch, remarked in passing that early this morning the second consul had left for Grenoble, together with 12 mules and his daughter. Grenouille forced back the tears and ran off, straight through town to the Porte du Cours. He stopped to sniff in the square before the gate, and in the pure west wind, unsullied by the odours of the town, he did indeed find his golden thread again, thin and fragile, but absolutely unmistakable. The precious scent, however, was not blowing from the northwest, where the road leads toward Grenoble, but more from the direction of Cabris, if not directly out of the southwest. Grenouille asked the watch which road the second consul had taken. The guard pointed north. Not the road to Cabris, or the other one, that went south towards Auribeau and La Napoule? Definitely not, said the guard. He had watched with his own eyes. Grenouille ran back through town to his cabin, packed linen, pomade pot, spatula, scissors, and a small, smooth club of olive wood into his knapsack, and promptly took to the road, not the road to Grenoble, but the one to which his nose directed him, to the south. This road, the direct road to La Napoule, led along the foothills of the Tannéron, through the river valleys of the Frayères and Siagne. It was an easy walk. Grenouille made rapid progress. As Auribeau emerged on his right, clinging to the mountains above him, he could smell that he had almost caught up with the runaways. A little later, and he had drawn even with them. He could now smell each one, could smell the aroma of their horses. At most they were no more than a half-mile west of him, somewhere in the forests of the Tannéron. They were holding course southwards, towards the sea, just as he was. Around 5 o'clock that evening, Grenouille reached La Napoule. He went to the inn, ate, and asked for cheap lodging. He was a journeyman tanner from Nice, he said, on his way to Marseille. He could spend the night in a stall, they told him. There he lay down in a corner and rested. He could smell the 3 riders approaching. He need only wait. 2 hours later, it was deep dusk by then, they arrived. To preserve their disguise, they had changed costumes. The 2 women now wore dark cloaks and veils, Richie a black frock coat. He identified himself as a nobleman on his way from Caslan. In the morning he wanted to be ferried over to the Ile de l'Airain. The innkeeper should make the arrangements for a boat to be ready by sunrise. Were there any other guests in the house besides himself and his people? No, said the innkeeper, only a journeyman tanner from Nice who was spending the night in a stall. Richie sent the women to their room. He was going out to the stalls, he said, to get something from the saddlebags. At first he could not find the journeyman tanner. He had to ask a groom to give him a lantern. Then he saw him, lying on some straw and an old blanket in one corner, his head resting on his knapsack, sound asleep. He looked so totally insignificant that for a moment Richie had the impression that he was not even there, but was merely a chimera cast by the swaying shadow of the lantern candle. At any rate, Richie was immediately convinced that there was no danger whatever to fear from this almost touchingly harmless creature, and he left very quietly so as not to disturb his sleep, and went back into the inn. He took his evening meal in his own room along with his daughter. He had not explained the purpose and goal of their journey to her, and did not do it even now, although she asked him. Tomorrow he would let her in on the secret, he said, but she could be certain that everything that he was planning and doing was for her good, and would work toward her future happiness. After their meal they played a few games of l'ombre, which he lost, because he was forever gazing at her face to delight in her beauty, instead of looking at his cards. Around 9 o'clock he brought her to her room, directly across from his own, kissed her good night, and locked the door from the outside. Then he went to bed himself. He was suddenly very tired from the exertions of the day and of the night before, and equally very satisfied with himself and how things had gone. Without the least thought of care, without any of the gloomy suspicions that until yesterday had plagued him and kept him awake every time he had put out his light, he instantly fell asleep and slept without a dream, without a moan, without a twitch or a nervous toss of his body back and forth. For the first time in a good while, Richie found deep, peaceful, refreshing sleep. Around the same time, Grenouille got up from his bed in the stall. He, too, was satisfied with how things were going, and felt completely refreshed, although he had not slept a single second. When Richie had come to the stall looking for him, he had only feigned sleep, augmenting the impression of obvious harmlessness he already exuded with his odour of inconspicuousness. Moreover, in contrast to the way in which Richie had perceived him, he had observed Richie with utmost accuracy, olfactory accuracy, and Richie's relief at the sight of him had definitely not escaped him. And so, at their meeting, each had convinced himself of the other's harmlessness, both correctly and falsely. And that was how it should be, Grenouille thought, for his apparent and Richie's true harmlessness made it much easier for him, Grenouille, to go about his work, an opinion that, to be sure, Richie would definitely have shared had the situation been reversed. 45. Grenouille set to work with professional circumspection. He opened his knapsack, took out the linen, pomade, and spatula, spread the cloth over the blanket on which he had lain, and began to brush on the fatty paste. This job took time, for it was important that the oil be applied in thinner or thicker layers depending on what part of the body would end up lying on a particular patch of the cloth. The mouth and armpits, breasts, genitals, and feet gave off greater amounts of scent than, for instance, shins, back, and elbows, the palms more than the backs of the hands, eyebrows more than eyelids, and so on, and therefore needed to be provided with a heavier dose of oil. Grenouille was creating a model, as it were, transferring onto the linen a scent diagram of the body to be treated, and this part of the job was actually the one that satisfied him most, for it was a matter of an artistic technique that incorporated equally one's knowledge, imagination, and manual dexterity, while at the same time it anticipated on an ideal plane the enjoyment awaiting one from the final results. Once he had applied the whole potful of pomade, he dabbed about here and there, removing a bit of oil from the cloth here, adding another there, retouching, checking the greasy landscape he had modelled one last time, with his nose, by the way, not with his eyes, for the whole business was carried on in total darkness, which was perhaps yet another reason for Grenouille's equably cheerful mood. There was nothing to distract him on this night of new moon. The world was nothing but odour and the soft sound of surf from the sea. He was in his element. Then he folded the cloth together like a tapestry, so that the oiled surfaces lay against one another. This was a painful procedure for him, because he knew well that despite the utmost caution, certain parts of the sculpted contours would be flattened or shifted, but there was no other way to transport the cloth. After he had folded it up small enough to be carried under his arm without all too much difficulty, he tucked spatula, scissors, and the little olive-wood club in his pockets, and crept out into the night. The sky was clouded over. There were no lights burning in the inn. The only glimmer on this pitch-dark night was the winking of the lighthouse at the fort on the Île Sainte-Marguerite, over a mile away to the east, a tiny bright needlepoint in a raven-black cloth. A light, fishy wind was blowing from the bay. The dogs were asleep. Grenouille walked to the back dormer of the threshing shed, where a ladder stood propped. He picked the ladder up, and, balancing it vertically, 3 rungs clamped under his free right arm, the rest of it pressed against his right shoulder, he moved across the courtyard until he was under her window. The window stood half ajar. As he climbed the ladder, as easily as a set of stairs, he congratulated himself on the circumstances that made it possible for him to harvest the girl's scent here in La Napoule. In Grasse, where the house had barred windows and was tightly guarded, all this would have been much more difficult. She was even sleeping by herself here. He would not have to bother with eliminating the maid. He pushed up the casement, slipped into the room, and laid down his cloth. Then he turned to the bed. The dominant scent came from her hair, for she was lying on her stomach with her head pressed into the pillow and framed by the crook of her arm, presenting the back of her head in an almost ideal position for the blow by the club. The sound of the blow was a dull, grinding thud. He hated it. He hated it solely because it was a sound in the midst of his otherwise soundless procedure. He could bear that gruesome sound only by clenching his teeth, and, after it was all over, standing off to one side, stiff and implacable, as if he feared the sound would return from somewhere as a resounding echo. But it did not return. Instead, stillness returned to the room, an increased stillness, in fact, for now even the shuffle of the girl's breathing had ceased. And at once Grenouille's tenseness dissolved. One might have interpreted it more as a posture of reverence or some sort of crabbed moment of silence, and his body fell back to a pliable ease. He tucked the club away, and from here on was all bustle and business. First he unfolded the impregnating cloth, spread it loosely on its back over the table and chairs, taking care that the greased side not be touched. Then he pulled back the bedclothes. The glorious scent of the girl, welling up so suddenly warm and massive, did not stir him. He knew that scent, of course, and would savour it to intoxication later on, once he truly possessed it. But now the main thing was to capture as much of it as possible, let as little of it as possible evaporate. For now the watchwords were concentration and haste. With a few quick snips of his scissors, he cut open her nightgown, pulled it off, grabbed the oiled linen, and tossed it over her naked body. Then he lifted her up, tugged the overhanging cloth under her, rolled her up in it as a baker rolls strudel, tucking in the corners, enveloping her from toes up to brow. Only her hair still stuck out from the mummy clothes. He cut it off close to her scalp and packed it inside her nightgown, which he then tied up into a bundle. Finally he took a piece of cloth still dangling free and flapped it over the shaved skull, smoothed down the overlapping ends, gently pressed it tight with a finger. He examined the whole package. Not a slit, not a hole, not one bulging pleat was left through which the girl's scent could have escaped. She was perfectly packed. There was nothing to do but wait for 6 hours, until the grey of dawn. He took the little armchair on which her clothes lay, dragged it to the bed, and sat down. The gentle breath of her scent still clung to the ample black cloak, blending with the odour of aniseed cakes she had put in her pocket as a snack for the journey. He put his feet up on the end of the bed, near her feet, covered himself with her dress, and ate aniseed cakes. He was tired, but he did not want to fall asleep, because it was improper to sleep on the job, even if your job was merely to wait. He recalled the nights he had spent distilling in Baldini's workshop, the soot-blackened alembic, the flickering fire, the soft spitting sound the distillate made as it dripped from the cooling tube into the Florentine flask. From time to time you had to tend the fire, pour in more distilling water, change Florentine flasks, replace the exhausted stuff you were distilling. And yet it had always seemed to him that you stayed awake not so that you could take care of these occasional tasks, but because being awake had its own unique purpose. Even here in this bedchamber, where the process of enfleurage was proceeding all on its own, where in fact premature checking, turning, or poking the fragrant package could only cause trouble, even here, it seemed to Grenouille, his waking presence was important. Sleep would have endangered the spirit of success. It was not especially difficult for him to stay awake and wait, despite his weariness. He loved this waiting. He had also loved it with the 24 other girls, for it was not a dull waiting till it's over, not even a yearning, expectant waiting, but an attendant, purposeful, in a certain sense active waiting. Something was happening while you waited. The most essential thing was happening. And even if he himself was doing nothing, it was happening through him nevertheless. He had done his best. He had employed all his artistic skill. He had not made one single mistake. His performance had been unique. It would be crowned with success. He need only wait a few more hours. It filled him with profound satisfaction, this waiting. He had never felt so fine in all his life, so peaceful, so steady, so whole and at one with himself, not even back inside his mountain, as during these hours when a craftsman took his rest sitting in the dark of night beside his victim, waiting and watching. They were the only moments when something like cheerful thoughts formed inside his gloomy brain. Strangely enough, these thoughts did not look toward the future. He did not think of the scent that he would glean in a few hours, nor of the perfume made of the auras of 25 maidens, nor of future plans, happiness, and success. No, he thought of his past. He remembered the stations of his life, from Madame Gaillard's house and the moist, warm woodpile in front of it, to his journey today to the little village of La Napoule, which smelled like fish. He thought of Grimal the tanner, of Giuseppe Baldini, of the Marquis de la Tailla d'Espinasse. He thought of the city of Paris, of its great effluvium, that evil smell of 1,000 iridescences. He thought of the red-headed girl in the Rue des Marais, of open country, of the spare wind, of forests. He thought, too, of the mountain in the Auvergne. He did not avoid such memories in the least, of his cave, of the air void of human beings. He thought of his dreams, and he thought of all these things with great satisfaction. Yes, it seemed to him, as he looked back over it, that he was a man to whom fortune had been especially kind, and that fate had led him down some tortuous paths, but that ultimately they had proved to be the right ones. How else would it have been possible for him to have found his way here, into this dark chamber, at the goal of his desires? He was, now that he really considered it, a truly blessed individual. Feelings of humility and gratitude welled up within him. "I thank you," he said softly. "I thank you, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, for being what you are." So touched was he by himself. Then his eyelids closed, not for sleep, but so that he could surrender himself completely to the peace of this holy night. The peace filled his heart, but it seemed also as if it rained all about him. He smelled the peaceful sleep of the maid in the adjoining room, the deep contentment of Antoine Richy's sleep on the other side of the corridor. He smelled the peaceful slumber of the innkeeper and his servants, of the dogs, of the animals in their stalls, of the whole village, and of the sea. The wind had died away. Everything was still. Nothing disturbed the peace. Once he turned his foot to one side, and ever so softly touched Laure's foot. Not actually her foot, but simply the cloth that enveloped it, and beneath that the thin layer of oil drinking up her scent, her glorious scent, his scent. 46. As the birds began to squawk, that is, a good while before the break of dawn, he got up and finished his task. He threw open the cloth and pulled it from the dead woman like a bandage. The fat peeled off nicely from her skin. Little scraps of it were left hanging only in the smallest crannies, and these he had to scrape off with his spatula. The remaining streaks of pomade he wiped off with her undershirt, using it to rub down her body from head to foot one last time, so thoroughly that even the oil in her own pores purled from her skin, and with it the last flake and filament of her scent. Only now was she really dead for him, withered away, pale and limp as a fallen petal. He tossed the undershirt into the large scent-impregnated cloth, the only place where she had life now, placed her nightgown and her hair in it as well, and rolled it all up into a small, firm package that he clamped under his arm. He did not even take the trouble to cover the body on the bed. And although the black of night had already become the blue-grey of dawn, and objects in the room had begun to regain their contours, he did not cast a single glance at the bed to rest his eyes on her at least once in his life. Her form did not interest him. She no longer existed for him as a body, but only as a disembodied scent, and he was carrying that under his arm, taking it with him. Softly he swung out over the window-sill and climbed down the ladder. The wind had come up again outside, and the sky was clearing, pouring a cold, dark blue light over the land. A half-hour later, the scullery maid started the fire in the kitchen. As she came out of the house to fetch wood, she saw the ladder leaning there, but was still too sleepy to make any rhyme or reason of it. Shortly after 6, the sun rose. Gigantic and golden red, it lifted up out of the sea between the Îles de l'Airain. Not a cloud was in the sky. A radiant spring day had begun. With his room facing west, Richy did not awaken until 7. He had slept truly splendidly for the first time in months, and contrary to his custom, lay there yet another quarter of an hour, stretching and sighing with enjoyment as he listened to the pleasant hubbub rising up from the kitchen below. When he finally did get up and open the window wide, taking in the beautiful weather outside and breathing in the fresh morning air and listening to the sound of the surf, his good mood knew no bounds, and he puckered his lips and whistled a bright melody. While he dressed, he went on whistling, and was whistling still as he left his room, and on winged feet approached the door to his daughter's room across the hall. He rapped, and rapped again, very softly, so as not to frighten her. There was no answer. He smiled. He could well understand that she was still sleeping. Carefully he inserted the key in the lock and turned the bolt. Softly, very softly, considerately, not wanting to wake her, eager almost to find her still sleeping, wanting to kiss her awake once again, one last time, before he must give her to another man. The door sprang open, he entered, and the sunlight fell full into his eyes. Everything in the room sparkled, as if it were filled with glittering silver, and for a moment he had to shut his eyes against the pain of it. When he opened them again, he saw Laure lying on her bed, naked and dead, and shorn clean and sparkling white. It was like his nightmare, the one he had dreamt in Grasse the night before last, and had forgotten again. Every detail came back to him now, as if in a blazing flash. In that instant everything was exactly as it had been in the dream, only very much brighter. 47. The news of Laure Richy's murder spread through the region of Grasse as fast as if the message had been, "The king is dead," or "War's been declared," or "Pirates have landed on the coast." And the awful sense of terror it triggered was similar as well. All at once the fear that they had so carefully forgotten was back again, as virulent as it had been last autumn, and with all the accompanying phenomena: panic, outrage, anger, hysterical suspicions, desperation. People stayed in their houses at night, locked up their daughters, barricaded themselves in, mistrusted one another, and slept no more. Everyone assumed it would continue this time as it had before, a murder a week. The calendar seemed to have been set back 6 months. The dread was more paralyzing, however, than 6 months earlier, for people felt helpless at the sudden return of a danger that they had thought well behind them. If even the bishop's anathema had proved useless, if even Antoine Richy, the great Richy, the richest man in town, the second consul, a powerful, prudent man who had every kind of assistance available, if even he could not protect his child, if the murderer's hand was not to be deterred even by the hallowed beauty of Laure, for indeed she seemed a saint to everyone who had known her, especially now, afterwards, now that she was dead, what hope was there of escaping this murderer? He was more cruel than the plague, for you could flee before the plague, but not before this murderer, as the case of Richy had proved. Apparently he possessed supernatural powers. He was most certainly in league with the devil, if he was not the devil himself. And so many people, especially the simpler souls, knew no better course than to go to church and pray, every tradesman to his patron, the locksmiths to St. Aloysius, the weavers to St. Crispin, the gardeners to St. Anthony, the perfumers to St. Joseph. And they took their wives and daughters with them, praying together, eating and sleeping in the church. They did not leave during the day themselves now, convinced that the only possible refuge from this monster, if any refuge was to be had, was under the protection of the despairing parish and the gaze of the Madonna. Seeing that the church had failed once already, other, quicker wits banded together in occult groups. Hiring at great expense a certified witch from Gourdon, they crept into one of the many limestone grottos of subterranean Grasse and celebrated black masses to curry the old gentleman's favour. Still others, in particular members of the upper middle class and the educated nobility, put their money on the most modern scientific methods, magnetizing their houses, hypnotizing their daughters, gathering in their salons for secret fluidal meetings, and employing telepathy to drive off the murderer's spirit with communal thought emissions. The guilds organized a penitential procession from Grasse to La Napoule and back. The monks from the town's 5 monasteries established services of perpetual prayer and ceaseless chants, so that soon unbroken lamentation was heard day and night, now on one street corner, now on another. Hardly anyone worked. Thus, with feverish passivity and something very like impatience, the people of Grasse awaited the murderer's next blow. No one doubted that it would fall, and secretly everyone yearned to hear the horrible news, if only in the hope that it would not be about him, but someone else. This time, however, the civil, regional and provincial authorities did not allow themselves to be infected by the hysterical mood of the citizenry. For the first time since the murderer of maidens had appeared on the scene, well-planned and effective cooperative efforts were instituted among the prefectures of Grasse, Draguignan and Toulon, among magistrates, police, commissaries, parliament and the navy. This cooperation among the powerful arose partly from a fear of a general civil uprising, partly from the fact that only since Laure Richy's murder did they have clues that made systematic pursuit of the murderer possible for the first time. The murderer had been seen. Obviously, they were dealing with the ominous journeyman tanner who had spent the night of the murder in the inn stables and disappeared the next morning without a trace. According to the joint testimony of the innkeeper, the groom, and Richy, he was a nondescript, shortish fellow, with a brownish coat and a coarse linen knapsack. Although in other respects the recollections of the 3 witnesses remained unusually vague, they had been unable to describe the man's face, hair colour, or manner of speech. The innkeeper did add that, if he was not mistaken, he had noticed something awkward or limping about the stranger's posture and gait, as if he had a wounded leg or a crippled foot. Armed with these clues, 2 mounted troops had taken up pursuit of the murderer by noon of the same day, following the maréchaussée in the direction of Marseille, one along the coast, the other taking the inland road. The environs of La Napoule were combed by volunteers. 2 commissioners from the provincial court at Grasse travelled to Nice to make inquiries about journeyman tanners. All ships departing from the ports of Fréjus, Cannes and Antibes were checked. The roads leading across the border into Savoy were blocked, and travellers required to identify themselves. For those who could read, an arrest warrant and description of the culprit appeared on all the town gates of Grasse, Vence and Gourdon, and on village church doors. Town criers made 3 announcements daily. The report of a suspected clubfoot, of course, merely confirmed the view that the culprit was none other than the devil himself, and tended more to arouse panic among the populace than to bring in useful information. But only after the presiding judge of the court in Grasse had, on Richy's behalf, offered a reward of no less than 200 livres for information leading to the apprehension of the murderer, did denunciations bring about the arrest of several journeyman tanners in Grasse, Oppiau and Gourdon, one of whom indeed had the rotten luck of limping. They were already considering subjecting the man to torture, despite a solid alibi supported by several witnesses, when, 10 days after the murder, a man from the city watch appeared at the magistrate's office and gave the following deposition. At noon, on the day in question, he, Gabriel Taliasco, captain of the guard, while engaged in his customary duties at the Porte du Cour, had been approached by an individual who, as he now realized, fit the description in the warrant almost exactly, and had been questioned repeatedly and insistently concerning the road by which the second consul and his caravan had departed the city that same morning. He had ascribed no importance to the incident, neither then nor later, and would most certainly have been unable to recall the individual purely on the basis of his own memory, so thoroughly unremarkable was the man, had he not seen him by chance only yesterday, right here in Grasse, in the Rue de la Louve, in front of the studio of Maître Drouot and Madame Arnulfi, on which occasion he had noticed that as the man walked back into the workshop he had a definite limp. Grenouille was arrested an hour later. The innkeeper and his groom from La Napoule, who were in Grasse to identify the other suspects, immediately recognized him as the journeyman tanner who had spent the night with them. It was he, and no other. This must be the wanted murderer. They searched the workshop, they searched the cabin in the olive grove behind the Franciscan cloister. In one corner, hardly hidden, lay the shredded nightgown, the undershirt, and the red hair of Laure Richy. And when they dug up the floor, piece by piece, the clothes and